Hi everybody. On our last video we talked about egoism, or actually introduced egoism, and we took a quick look at, not a very quick look, but a little bit of a lengthy look at Epicureanism. And in this session we're going to be continuing with egoism, but we're going to turn to a different philosopher, and I want to bring up Thomas Hobbes. So let's take a look at Thomas Hobbes. This is going to be a much shorter overview of the thinker than we did with Epicurus, but Thomas Hobbes' background is dates 1588 to 1679, from Malmesbury, England, Oxford Universities, where he worked, and he wrote, of course, his most famous book, Leviathan, in 1651. Now, we looked at the egoism of Epicurus, and he was definitely a kind of a combination, perhaps, of a moral and psychological egoist. Hobbes is very much a psychological egoist. This is, again, a view of human nature, if you recall our introduction to egoism. And his basic view is set out in his work, The Leviathan. And he believed that the motivation for all voluntary actions, of course, involuntary actions, this doesn't really come into play, but for all voluntary actions, the motivation is always the benefit that we're going to seek for ourselves. And these are some quotes. He says, "Of the voluntary acts of every man, the object is some good to himself. For no man giveth but with intention of good to himself, because gift is voluntary, and of all voluntary acts the object is to every man his own good. Every man by nature seeketh his own benefit and promotion. By necessity of nature men choose that which appeareth best for themselves." So, again, psychological egoism is the idea that this is just how we behave naturally. It's a descriptive statement about human tendencies. Hobbes distinguishes three types of acts. Here, talked in those quotes about voluntary acts. And those are really the only ones that are going to matter for ethical discussion. Voluntary acts, of course, are those that we choose, and they're motivated all the time, every one of them, by Hobbes' account, by the benefit of the agent. Everything you do is motivated by the fact that you seek some good for yourself in doing it. Okay. Another type of action would be vital actions. Of course, those are not chosen. They're just part of the natural operations of your body, heartbeat, breathing. Then you've got accidental acts, which are, again, not chosen, so we don't need to pay attention to them. So the voluntary acts are the key. Now, here are the implications of his particular psychological egoistic view. It rules out, again, the possibility of altruism altogether. Altruism we already defined. Psychological theory claiming that people sometimes do act in a sacrificial way for the good of other people, okay, and that they don't do it for their best interest themselves. Moral theory claiming that people sometimes ought to sacrifice what they take to be their own best interest for the interest of others. So altruism isn't saying that you always have to act in somebody else's interest over your own. It's just saying that it's possible to do that, and sometimes we ought to do that. That would be altruism. And altruism is often associated with religions like Christianity. And here are a couple quotes that give you this altruistic aspect. And some quotes actually rule out possibly egoism. So here in Luke 14:26, it says, "If any man cometh unto me and hateth not his own life, he cannot be my disciple." So the idea here, if you must hate yourself, that tends to rule out the egoistic motivation. But other passages don't seem at all to rule out egoism as they advocate altruism, like love thy neighbor as thyself. Right? So it assumes there is some type of self-love that is to direct us in how we're supposed to love other people, or even do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Just a different, basically saying the same thing in a different way. Now, if altruism is impossible, then it cannot be a moral duty. That would make sense. And Hobbes would say altruism is actually impossible. And we already saw the phrase, ought implies can. If it's impossible, then we can't have a duty to be altruistic. Can one then ever sacrifice what one takes to be one's own interest in order to act in the interests of another? And it appears that we do this, and people sometimes do this quite often. Now, Hobbes believed this is possible only if one perceives it to be in one's interest at a certain level. But if you perceive it to be in one's interest, then it doesn't seem to be true altruism. Now, let's take a look at a situation and see how Hobbes would break this down. Situation is you've got a drowning child, and the person's going to jump into the dangerous waters because they're dangerous waters, and it's possible that you can risk your life doing that, risking your own life to save the child. Okay, so you got the picture. Child's drowning, rushing river, dangerous sea, whatever it may be. Person jumps in at the risk of their own life to save this child. Now, explanations for that act can range from A through L, as you see on the screen. And the motivation is in the column next to that. So, explanation for the act A, well, I saw that the child would drown if I didn't act. So that explains why I acted. And the motivation is this idea of responsibility. B, I saw it as my duty to save her. That explains the act. And the motivation, of course, is duty. C, only an animal would have stood by to let her die. Explains the act. And the motivation would be some kind of natural sentiment. D, I know the family and I care about the girl. Perhaps it's love that motivates. E, her father helped me once when I was in need. So you get the motivation of perhaps guilt. Debt. F, I'm not sure why I did it. And that's possible. Maybe you don't know exactly why you just did it. Well, almost like with not thinking, which point we don't really know what the motivation is. G, my conscience would have plagued me for the rest of my life if I didn't do it. So kind of motivated by the possibility of guilt or the avoidance of guilt. H, I didn't want people to say I was a coward. So you're concerned with your reputation. Hope to get some recognition. Concerned with your reputation. I wanted to satisfy a need that I have to help others. Self-aggrandizement. K, I wanted to achieve a benefit for myself. Hobbes would call this Hobbesian honesty. And L, I wanted the pleasant satisfaction that heroism afforded me, which is hedonism. Now you notice there's a continuum from altruism at the top to egoism at the bottom. The ones furthest towards the top seem the most altruistic, and the ones closest to the bottom or furthest down on the bottom seem the most egoistic. How would Hobbes interpret all of these? Well, in the example case, we commonly distinguish different motives, right? Now, Hobbes would say that A through J, go back, A through J, responsibility all the way through moral aggrandizement, are all versions of K, which are Hobbesian honesty, and K itself is just a version of L, which is hedonism. So Hobbes defined benefit in terms of pleasure. He was a hedonist. He says, pleasure or delight is the appearance or sense of good, and molestation or displeasure the appearance or sense of evil. What he's got is really a monistic concept of motivation. All types of motivation that we can point to boil down or collapse into one motivation, which was hedonism. Self-interest. Apparently, a plurality of reasons at best is illusory. It's an illusion. It doesn't really exist. That's why it's called Hobbesian honesty. If you were honest with yourself, you'd realize that you did it for yourself in every one of those situations. Hobbes does talk about striving after power, and on his view, this is either indicates that power might be necessary to attain pleasure, or that power itself is a form of pleasure. So, again, it collapses. I'm going to skip this video, and let's look at a little bit of criticism of this psychological egoism. Number one, it's illegitimate to derive egoism from the fact that people derive pleasure from the successful achievement of their intentions. Just because we do take pleasure or have pleasure when we have successfully achieved something that we are after doesn't necessarily prove we're egoists. Right? Because we might derive our pleasure from helping a person out of a pit, but the motive for that action may actually be to help the other person out of the pit and not the pleasure that is perhaps a side effect. Deriving pleasure is indifferent to the motive. The primary reason that we act, we would consider the motive. What actually moves you to do it? And if pleasure is not consciously on the mind, some people could doubt that pleasure is the actual motive. Okay, Hobbes wouldn't agree to that, but that's one criticism. Number two is egoism is unfalsifiable. How does the egoist know that human action is always motivated by self-interest? Is it a claim that's based on empirical fact? Can you test it? Can you see this? Is the claim the result of some kind of scientific investigation? Well, according to the principle of falsification, for a hypothesis to be a scientific one, there has to be some state or conditions under which the hypothesis can be shown to be false or refuted. Problem with Hobbes' psychological egoism is there is no data, even theoretically, that could refute Hobbes' view. His theory claims to account for all possible data, all possible motivations are covered with his hedonistic egoism. Every theory that is compatible with every possible state of affairs doesn't seem to be a very good theory at all, because real theories have to exclude some possibilities. That's the second problem. Let's do a thought experiment, and we'll kind of move towards a resolution of this small little session. Let's create a scenario where there's a totalitarian government. You and a total stranger are arrested. You're charged with treason. You're thrown into a room separate from each other with no possible way to communicate, and you're interrogated, each separately. The police refuse to believe that you're innocent, even though you claim innocence the entire time, and they demand that you confess. They have to have a conviction. They're not going to let you guys go unless they get a conviction. So they place a deal on the table, and this is the way it works. If the other man does not confess, but you do, and testify against him, you get to go free. He's going to end up 10 years in prison. They've got their confession and conviction. Everything's fine. You're a free man. Option 2, if he confesses but you don't, it's the exact reverse. He goes free. You get the 10 years in prison. If you both confess, you get a half sentence, 5 years each. Of course, if neither of you confess, since there isn't enough evidence to convict you fully, the best they can do is hold you, and the time limit that they can hold you for is, let's say, a year. And then you have to be released. So you've got those 4 options. Really not 4 options, because you really only have a very simple choice of confessing or not confessing. But the question is, what do you do? Do you confess or not? And then you could stop this video, like I said, at any time and think through these things. How would you make the choice? What type of reasoning process are you going to employ to figure out what's best to do? And is the principle going to be what's best for you? Well, let's kind of break it down. Here's a chart. At the top, we're looking at what he can do. He can confess or he may not confess. On the side are your choices. I confess or I don't. Now, if you look at the intersection of both of those choice columns, if he confesses and you confess, again, there's a 5-year penalty. If he doesn't, you do, you go free. If you don't, but he confesses, you get 10 years. And again, if neither of you confess, you're stuck there for a year. So you could probably ask yourself, what's the best choice for you? Well, it seems if you want the best outcome, best situation possible would be freedom, right? And if you want the best possible outcome, that is only found in the column where you confess. And he doesn't. But again, you don't have control on what he does. So again, you want the best outcome, you're going to confess. So, here's the problem. I shouldn't have brought that up too quickly, because I think you could probably figure it out yourself. If you're shooting for the best possible outcome of confessing, what do you think he's doing in the other room? He's probably thinking, the best possible outcome for me also is confessing. I'm either going to get freedom or I'm going to get 5 years. You're not going to get the worst possible outcome, which is 10 years. So, being reasonable, both of you are going to confess. And of course, what happens if you both confess? You're going to end up with 5 years in prison. So acting egoistically, you actually end up worse off than if you acted altruistically. Seeing as how the 1 year is better than 5 years, and if you both acted altruistically and did not confess, you'd both end up with 1 year which is the second best option. So egoism here results in worse condition than if you acted altruistically. Problem is you didn't communicate, but what would happen if you did or could communicate with one another? Would that change the outcome? Now you may be thinking, well, if I trust the person, then yeah, we could both say, all right, I'm not going to confess, you don't confess, we'll both be out of here in a year. Of course, if you don't know the person, as soon as you promise that you're not going to confess, he may just confess, and you end up with 10 years and he goes free. So again, how do you make sure you get the best possible outcome, even with communication? Well, let's take a look. Obviously, by cooperating, everyone can come off better than if they acted independently in their own interests. And this leads to Hobbes' famous theory on the social contract. So I just want to talk about this briefly because perhaps the social contract is the way we determine what's right and wrong when we look at the way people interact within society. So here are the assumptions that Hobbes has us. Number one, there's no God. There's no issuing of moral commands, no reward for virtuous actions. There's no also natural human purposes, right? It's a non-teleological view of reality. And he's, again, a psychological egoist. That's in the background. We will do what is in our best interest. And there's nothing else out there to really constrain us, ultimately speaking. So what can we base morality on in that kind of situation? Well, for him, a social contract, which is, again, an agreement among various members that form a society. Morality is going to be the solution to very practical problems that arise when self-interested human beings interact. Morality consists in a set of rules governing behavior that rational people will accept on the condition that other people accept them as well. That's why you need this idea of a contract. It's not just that rational people would accept these as behaviors. There needs to be some way to tie people to holding up these rules, or abiding by these rules, some kind of enforcement of these rules. So let's look at what the world would look like. Number one, we all want to flourish, right? We all want to be happy. That is our desire. And that, of course, requires that we have the benefits of some kind of peaceful and cooperative social order. You can't really flourish if you're in a constant state of struggle and fear. So it requires rules, and the enforcement of those rules, like I just said. If you've ever watched Walking Dead, this is a great example of a show that investigates, what the world would be like when you really have a disintegration of the social fabric and rules and law and order and government. People that are kind of out for themselves, again, very egoistic scenario. So just imagine life without enforced social rules. This is what Hobbes would call the state of nature. And you may be free in the state of nature, but there's also a very terrifying aspect to the state of nature because of the competition with other people that are also free to act as they will. It's awful. Nobody wants to actually live in this state of nature because of the terror. Even with the freedom, you don't want to trade the terror. And it's due to four basic facts about human beings. Number one, we all have an equality of need. We all need certain things to survive and be happy. And those things that we need are ultimately fairly scarce. And there's going to be competition for those things. Third, there's an equality of human power. In struggling for these things, maybe I'm not as strong as the next guy over, but if I gather together with my buddy, then we can balance these things out. And again, this is going to be the struggle. It's this equilibrium. And of course, you have very limited altruism, and egoism is the rule. So, what should we do? You've got this ongoing competition. Constant state of war, every man for themselves, and ultimately there's going to be no winner, right? It never is resolved. All right, this is historically observable in certain situations. The French Revolution, which ended up in all kinds of anarchy, fall of the Roman Empire, perhaps. Of course, the zombie apocalypse is always like that if you watch The Walking Dead. But the solution, of course, is to escape this state of nature. And people have to agree on the rules if they're going to do this. One of the rules, of course, would not be to harm other people. So even the egoist, again, is going to be willing to restrict some of their own ability to pursue their goals for this is a trade-off, right? We want to keep our promises. this would be another part of the rules, right? Not to harm one another, keep your promises. Rules have to be enforced, so you'd probably need some kind of legal punishment, some kind of government system at some level. Hobbes actually advocated some kind of monarchy. And again, this could be by public opinion as well, right? There's pressure that's put on us by public opinion. And, of course, this is ultimately what we're talking about when we talk about a social contract. Self-interest can be set aside for the benefit of everybody. Altruism actually becomes possible in this kind of situation. And why is that? It's because others are agreeing to do the exact same thing. And of course, without the enforcement, then you can't trust that others will do the same thing. So it ultimately collapses back into a state of nature. But we're willing in this situation to give up one thing that is in our self-interest, which is freedom, for the sake of security. That's kind of how Hobbes would analyze the situation. It's a trade-off. As egoistic, hedonistic, psychological egoists who are always out for our own self-interest at the expense of others. If we're honest, that's how we normally behave. The only way to resolve this kind of conflict that is going to arise is through the social contract. Now that's everything that I was going to cover in this particular video. A lot shorter, like I promised you guys. So next time we will pick up with the final section on egoism, which is going to be on Ayn Rand. And I will look forward to seeing you guys then. Take care.